Hello, my name's Greg Leake, and I'm a member of the SQL Server 2012 technical marketing team, and I concentrate on SQL Azure, our cloud-based database, which is based on SQL Server 2012 technologies. I'm going to take a few minutes here to present some of the key capabilities of SQL Azure, and also do a demonstration to show you what this database up in the cloud looks like and how you can use it. So the first thing about SQL Azure that you need to understand is it's a managed database service. What does this mean? It means the database you actually provision up in one of our Microsoft Azure global data centers. So you don't have to buy any hardware, you don't have to buy a SQL Server license. You literally just use a web-based management interface to go provision your database, and you're charged just based on the size of that database, a small monthly charge. Depending on the size, it could just be a few dollars per month. But you don't have to do any operating system installations or operating system patching. You don't have to worry about any of the hardware. All that's taken care of for you by Microsoft in our global data centers. So it's very easy to provision and manage these databases. The second thing you need to know about SQL Azure is fault tolerance is built in. So automatically you have a high availability service that has, for instance, a 99.9% uptime SLA associated with it. The other thing that you really need to know about SQL Azure is it works just like SQL Server from a development and management perspective. So all the T-SQL you're used to using as a SQL Server DBA, or the development technologies like ADO.NET, or Java with JDBC, or even PHP, all of these work the same from a programming standpoint, just as if you're programming against a local SQL Server database. So if we were to compare SQL Server 2012, which runs, of course, on-premise, versus SQL Azure, which is running it as a managed service up in one of our global data centers, you'll see that with SQL Server 2012, of course, you get enterprise class scale up as a data platform. Up in the cloud, you also get scale out and scale up capabilities with SQL Azure so that you can provision more databases and scale those databases out and provision additional capacity as you require it, kind of very much on the fly, so very flexible and automatic scaling. You have multiple hardware platforms supported on SQL Server on-prem. The difference is with SQL Azure, we take care of the hardware for you. You've got world-class, high-performance hardware, and you just provision your server or your database on top of that hardware. Never manage that hardware, don't have to patch it, don't have to worry about downtime. All that's taken care of for you by Microsoft. And of course, typically SQL Server 2012 is licensed as a box product for on-premise deployments. With SQL Azure, you don't need a SQL Server license. You just go provision your server once you've got a subscription, and you pay based on the databases that you provision, a small monthly or commitment-based offers. Complete symmetry in terms of programming model between SQL Server 2012 and SQL Azure. So this means all the T-SQL you work with, support for all your code, your existing code libraries in Java, .NET, PHP work just like it's SQL Server on-premise, and the ecosystem of familiar tools such as Visual Studio, SQL Server Management Studio, and the like. Just work with SQL Azure the same as they work with SQL Server 2012 on-premise. I wanted to talk a little bit about where our data centers are located and how we build in fault tolerance. When you provision a new SQL Azure database, you choose a logical server location, and we've got shown here on the map 6 different data centers you can choose from. 2 in North America, 2 in Europe, and 2 in Asia. Once you provision that logical server, you can create multiple databases on that server. And every database you create on that server has a primary database and 3 online replicas. And this means those replicas are actually failover nodes. So you have an always-on capability here with the fault tolerance such that if any node fails, we've got quorums of replicated databases where those writes are actually replicated to, and you have absolutely no application downtime. And this is why we can offer an uptime SLA, service level agreement, with SQL Azure because of this fault tolerance that's built into the platform. Another really key capability of SQL Azure is the ability to create something called a federated database, so SQL Azure Federation. And this is the ability to actually take a single database and break it up into multiple physical nodes. And that provides you scale out capabilities at the data tier. So instead of having one large database serviced by one physical server with one set of CPU and I/O capacity, you can chop that database up, that one logical database, across many, even hundreds of physical nodes, thus getting scale out across CPU and I/O capacity for that database. So this is a really key feature that's introduced with SQL Azure that you get. In fact, just as an example, here we have a single 20 gigabyte database, and if you stage it just on one physical server, of course you've got only the CPU and I/O capacity of that one server. But with SQL Azure Federation, you can make that physical or logical database many physical nodes and spread that CPU and I/O across many physical servers servicing the capacity and get tremendous scale. So as the demand on your database increases with more users using the apps that do that, those database queries, you can just scale up on the fly and scale back down on the fly as well, such that you don't actually have to pay more than what you're using. So you really pay on a consumption basis. It's a very economical, very fast, and very scalable solution. So with that, I want to give you a little demonstration to show you what a SQL Azure application looks like and what some of the management of a SQL Azure database actually looks like. Okay, to get started, I thought I would show actually SQL Azure in action powering a Windows Azure application, because after all, SQL Azure is a cloud database as described in the session, and I want to show the type of application that you can build with SQL Azure up in the Windows Azure Cloud Platform. So I've created a sample app here. This is actually, you can browse along and even download the code for this at https azurestocktrader.cloudapp.net. And the bottom line is you can build a wide variety of applications against a SQL Azure database, just as you can build a wide variety of applications against SQL Server 2012. In this case, this application is using a SQL Azure backing database for kind of a simulated stock trading application. So this is a web-based app done in .NET, running up on the Windows Azure platform. And I'm going to go ahead and log in as a user and take a look at my portfolio and see how my stocks are doing here. So I'll log in as demo user. And we'll see, just like with a normal SQL Server-based application, whether it's web-based or Windows-based, the database works exactly the same as SQL Server 2012, except this database is staged and running in one of our global data centers. In this case, this data center is in the United States. So I get my stock portfolio information, some market summary data, all this coming live out of the SQL Azure database. If I was to go and look at my portfolio, I can see that I've got multiple holdings, currently 250 holdings, different stocks that I've bought over the last several months as I do this demo. I can sort and subtotal those by the actual stock symbol and see how my portfolio is doing. Looks like I'm doing pretty well overall. I've made quite a little bit of money here over the simulated trading application. But what I want you to notice is the amount of data coming back in these pages. I'll look at my last orders. Here's my last 200 orders. These are all live SQL queries against SQL Azure. Very fast, very performant, even though the database is totally managed and running up in a Microsoft Azure data center. So I just wanted to give you a sense for, you build an application just like you would build it for an on-prem SQL Server database, but in this case you provision automatically the database up in our data center. You don't have to worry about installing software, patching software, and the like. Okay, so that's just a sample app and showing you some of the speed of the queries, just normal queries. By the way, the same queries work on SQL Server 2012 just like they work on SQL Azure, because of course SQL Azure is based on SQL Server 2012 technologies. So now let's take a look at some of the management capabilities for provisioning and managing your actual database. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to something very familiar to SQL Server 2012 customers, and this is SQL Server Management Studio. So this is actually the release candidate of SSMS, the Management Studio that works just fine with SQL Server on-premises databases, but also works really well with SQL Azure Cloud databases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect up here to my local server, which is a SQL Server 2012 server. And I'm going to sign in here to my local server, which is on-prem and actually running here on my local network as an on-premises database. So here's SQL Server Management Studio, just like DBAs know and love, working with SQL Server for my on-premises database. Now, to get a database up and staged in the cloud, I just want to show you how easy it is, starting with a database that I've got defined here on my local network. So here's a sample database, my on-premise demo database. I'm going to open up that up in Management Studio and show you here. We got a couple of tables defined. We've got a view defined. we've got a stored procedure defined. So this is just a typical database with the T-SQL views, table definitions, foreign keys, and the like, running on premises as a SQL Server 2012 database. I'm going to move this now up into the cloud. And to do that, all I have to do is right-click here on this database and go to my task view. And we'll see here I can deploy directly to SQL Azure up in one of our global data centers. So I'm going to go ahead and do the deployment and choose Next. I'm now going to choose the server that's in my SQL Azure subscription to connect to. And in this case, I've got a server here defined up in the cloud. This happens to be in our Chicago data center. And I can go ahead and sign in with my credentials as an administrator and connect up to that cloud database. I can choose the addition. How big do I want my database? And of course, I'm only going to be charged based on the size of the database, a very small rate per month based on the size. This is a small database, so I'm going to choose the web edition in a 1 gigabyte size, and then just simply click Next. And then this wizard's going to go through and move my entire on-premise database, including the schema, the views, the stored procedures, and the data, right up into my SQL Azure Cloud database. So I've got it ready to service users and applications up in the cloud. So we'll see that that's a success. And at this point, I've now, in one click essentially, or a couple of clicks, moved an entire database up into the cloud. To see that, I'm going to take SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to make a new connection. So I'm going to connect my Object Explorer to that cloud database, which is this database server right here. And I'll sign in with my credentials. And I'll connect up. And you'll see that from SQL Server Management Studio, I can have a real nice management experience across hybrid deployments. In other words, up top I'm looking at my local on-premise databases in Database Server, which I started with. And down below I have my Azure node. And here are my cloud-based databases on this database server that has been provisioned for me up in the cloud. And here's that database that I just moved, including its tables and its views. And of course, I showed you that it had a stored procedure as well. So very easily, I can work in one integrated environment, moving a database from on-premises up to the cloud, or vice versa. Use SQL Server Management Studio to help manage both on-premises deployments as well as databases deployed up in the cloud. The last thing I want to show is a little bit of the integrated web-based management capabilities that we provide with SQL Azure. So I'm going to go over here to my web browser, and I'm going to show you that I'm inside my Windows Azure portal. And in this portal, there are a couple of tabs of interest. One is Data Sync, and this is where I can actually set up and provision a service that will automatically synchronize between on-premises databases and my cloud-based databases. So as orders are placed, updates are made to your on-prem database or your cloud database, you can have those synchronized across, even bidirectionally, your on-premise deployment and your cloud-based deployment as an optional feature. The other tab I want to show is this Database tab, where I can now get a view of both my database servers and my databases contained in those servers. And again, these servers exist up in our Azure global data centers, either in Europe, Asia, or North America, depending on how you set it up when you created the logical server. And you'll see here when I take a look at this, I'm going to refresh this view for the server where I moved the database. You'll see there's the database that I moved from on-prem up into the cloud, which is my on-premises demo database now running up in a global data center. I'm going to go ahead and manage that server. And so I'm going to choose the Manage Server node. And I'm going to show you the management portal that's entirely web-based. So you actually don't need any local software installation whatsoever to manage and do some very interesting things with your databases up in the cloud directly from a web browser. So I'll sign in here with my credentials to this server that I want to manage. And as I mentioned, this server happens to be, I provisioned this one up in one of our North America data centers. And it's going to connect right up to that database server and show me the SQL Azure Management Portal. This is a Metro-style UI, so very similar to the UI that's coming out with the next version of Windows, Windows 8, and what you get actually on Windows Phone today, which is a tile-based interface for managing. And here we get an overview of all the databases I have staged on this server. You can see I can open this up, and get a quick summary information. It looks like I've got 6 databases defined, and they're different editions, and they're sorted by the size. So these are 1 gigabyte databases, and I've got some larger ones defined down below. And I can take a look at a nice summary view of these databases as well. And in fact, here's that database I moved up into the cloud, and let's do some management. I'm going to go ahead and now click on the design button for this database. And you can see here via the web interface, I can go ahead and create tables or edit table definitions. So let's go ahead and edit the customer table. And this is, again, just fully relational database based on SQL Server 2012, but running in hardware and software that's automatically managed by Microsoft in our data centers. And if I wanted to change one of these columns, you can see here are all the familiar data types that you get with SQL Server 2012, but these are now on SQL Azure, so it's just like managing and running a SQL Server database. So I could change a data type here, I could add a new column, delete columns. I can also look at my indexes and keys, my foreign keys, and any indexes I have defined. And I can also just click on the Data tab and see the data that actually exists within this database. So it gives you a quick sense for managing a database. I'm going to go back to my overview screen here, and I'm going to pick a different database, one that I've got running that demo app that I showed, that stock trader app. And let's go ahead and take a look at the actual stock trader database. And I'm going to go to the summary view. And it's going to show me how big this database is and give me some query performance metrics over the past trailing 3 months. So in this case, from February back into December, the queries that have been run and some of the performance characteristics. Also a reading of how many users are actively connected to this database, the size of the database, the free space, etc. I'm going to go over to the Query Performance tab, and here I'm going to get a nice summary view of all the queries that have been run against this SQL Azure database and their performance levels, including the percent of CPU time the query is taking, the latency, how long the query is taking to complete in milliseconds. And you can see these are actually sub-millisecond queries. They're running that fast. Any physical reads and writes and logical reads writes for these queries. And in fact, if I was to take a particular query, in fact, let's open one up here that I've got on my desktop. And I'm going to show you something pretty cool for tuning your queries. So I'm going to pick a new query here. And here's the T-SQL editor, so you can create queries, manage your T-SQL right here in the web console. I can actually run this query, and we'll get the data displayed from the query results down below. But what I want to do is I want to show you the query plan. So this will show you how to help tune your query, what the costs of specific T-SQL queries are. So I'm now going to look at that query plan. We'll go to this view, and you can see here, I can zoom in and zoom out of this view down below. And this is going to show me the costs of the query in terms of CPU time and I/O time. So this is the total cost across CPU and I/O. Here I can look at just the CPU time and where I'm spending time in this particular join query, or my I/O cost for this particular query, which I've just clicked on. So a very convenient tool. Now the other thing I want to do is go back to the overview page and drill down on yet another database I have active. So we'll go ahead and select that database, and I'm going to go and click the design button for this database. And another really neat thing about this web-based management console for SQL Azure is I can look at dependencies for tables and queries. So here's a table, and I'm going to say, show me all the dependencies of that table. What are the foreign key relationships defined that this table depends on? And you can see I've got 2 here. Now if I select one of the tables that this particular one is related to, it will then drill down and show me the dependencies of that particular table. And I can zoom in and zoom out and see how that expands automatically. And what I might want to do is actually see all the dependencies of my entire schema for all the tables defined. And here it is, and again I can zoom in and zoom out, and from here get a really nice quick visual sense of how my tables are related, directly edit those tables from this view, and do other management tasks. So the final thing I wanted to show is I mentioned this is the new Metro style UI that we're bringing out with Windows 8 here running in a web browser. I can then show you all those tiles just by going to my work. You know, as a DBA or database administrator, you might be working on many databases at once, tuning different queries, seeing relationships. And so this view here shows me all my open tiles, all my active work windows, organized by the database I'm working against, and I can just select which window I want to go to continue working there. So a very convenient view is this My Workspace that shows me all my active tiles as I complete various management tasks within the web-based management console. Okay, so that's just a quick demo. I showed you a real live app running against SQL Azure. Again, that can be a .NET or Java or even PHP app working against SQL Azure, just as if you were working against a SQL Server 2012 database. It's just a different connection string, and it's very easy to work with all the existing tools that we have. I'm giving you a demo of provisioning a new database and moving it from on-premises up into the SQL Azure cloud in one of the global Windows Azure data centers. And I've given you a quick overview of some of the management capabilities in the SQL Azure web-based management console. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that demonstration. And just to close, here's some key next steps for you. Number 1, take the tour. 2, sign up for the free trial subscription. And 3, start building cloud apps today using the familiar tools you already know and love that work against SQL Server. And to do that, the best place to get started is actually here at windowsazure.com. That's got the tour, the free subscription, and all the SDKs and tools and instructions for getting started working with Windows Azure with SQL Azure as your backing database up in the cloud. Also, you can learn more, you can get more, and you can do more by looking at the resources shown on this slide. Thank you very much for your time.